from me on behalf of the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing. My name is Godela Weiss-Sussex, and the first thing I want to say is thank you very much to Adina Balint, who has been putting together this seminar. So thank you for joining us for this. We're looking into representations of everyday life in contemporary literature and cultural productions, of course, and we have three speakers. So the three speakers are looking at this subject from different points of view, from different approaches, and they will also be using quite different materials. So we'll have a contribution on diaries, on poetry, and then a more sort of conceptual talk on what écriture du quotidien is. So the idea is that I will briefly introduce the speakers, and then each of them will have a brief presentation between 10 and 12 minutes. And that gives us ample time at the end for questions and answers. We will be recording this session, so if there's anyone who doesn't want to be recorded, just keep that in mind, and if you want to ask your question later on, put them in the chat rather than speaking, if that's what you prefer. So, okay, let's start. So, just a brief introduction to our three speakers. The first speaker is Monja Stahlberger. She's a third year PhD candidate at the ILCS in London. And she is working in her PhD thesis on notions of belonging in diaries of Kindertransport refugees in the United Kingdom. Our second speaker is Dominique Hétu. She is assistant professor in the Department of Francophone Studies and Languages at Brandon University in Manitoba, Canada. And her research focuses on feminist care ethics and politics and contemporary women's writing. Our third speaker is Adina Balint. She's professor of French literature at the University of Winnipeg, also in Manitoba. She's currently working on a project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and she's working on representations of everyday life experiences in contemporary Quebecois and French literatures. So that's the lineup. Monja, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen, and then hopefully you can all see that. Right. Can you all see this? Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction and for the chance to be here. I'm honoured to kick off our event on representation on everyday life, and I'm going to speak about writing the everyday in diaries of the Kindertransport. And this presentation sets out to explore what it means to write about everyday experiences in wartime diaries of unaccompanied child and adolescent refugees from National Socialist Germany who came to the UK in Kindertransport in 1938-39. The French scholar Philippe Lejeune, who has written extensively on this subject, highlights the fragmentary nature of the diary in his 2020 article, The Practice of Writing a Diary. And I quote, "Few people adhere to a strict daily regime of writing over a long period of time, recording as much as possible and in detail. Most diaries follow a theme, an episode, or a single thread of the fabric of a life." His claim emphasizes the selective process that occurs during the practice of writing in the diary, and at the same time, he draws attention to the diary as a medium that is anchored in everyday life. The argument is that while diary writing as a practice can give the diarists themselves continuity and stability, the content is fragmentary and selective. In her 2022 talk, Writing Home and Heimat on Refugee Diaries, Kathryn Sederberg considers the practice of keeping a diary as a cycle of reading, remembering, and constructing life stories. Narrating one's own everyday experiences then can be seen as, on the one hand, a tool to make sense of social, political, or historical circumstances, and, on the other hand, as a method of self-reflection and discovery. utilizing the diary as 1, an everyday object, 2, a mediator between past, present, and future, and 3, as a matrix for recounting personal experience in a historical or social context, can influence how and where the individual diarist situates themselves in an everyday life discourse. In her 2017 article, Writing Through Crisis, in her 2002 article, Writing Through Crisis, Sederberg discusses the diary during World War II. She argues that the diary consists of repetitive text segments, entries that create ruptures in the narration of a life. Her observations highlight that the practice of diary writing functions as a way of trying to narrate experiences and impose a sort of structure to certain fragments of life. So while the diary provides a space of possibility and opportunity to write with regularity about everyday experiences, creating a sense of continuity, it also leaves the reader with a fragmentary narrative of the everyday life of the diarist. To link these considerations of diary studies with everyday theory, I want to draw on what the French social scientist Michel de Certeau refers to as tactics or ways of operating. And I quote, "Everyday practices, ways of operating or doing things no longer appear as merely the obscure background of social activity," end quote. In other words, everyday practices are a conscious decision of the individual within everyday life, and they take on distinct functions. De Certeau's approach aims to resist or even subvert the repetitiveness of everydayness for everyday practices and experiences, and they become a tool of resistance and change. He points out that, quote, "Everyday practices, talking, reading, moving about, shopping, cooking, etc., are tactical in character, and so are, more generally, many ways of operating," end quote. This links to the diary insofar as these practices are not only methods to negotiate notions of the self privately, but they also define and redefine the individual's understanding of and their positioning in everyday life itself. So following Desirée Henderson's suggestion that the diary tell us stories in ways that defy our expectations and require us to read differently, I propose to read the diary through the lens of everyday theory and to regard it as an everyday practice that allows the diarist and us readers to reflect on numerous aspects and practices of everyday life. Bringing together de Certeau's theoretical considerations on everyday life and tactics with methodological approaches to diary studies, therefore can reveal new ways of looking at the representation of everyday life during wartime and exile. One of the questions I'm asking in my research is to what extent does diary writing of Kindertransport refugees enable us to understand the negotiation of everyday life and what it consisted of during exile, and with that, their notions of belonging. Joseph Amato expands on the idea of narrating everyday life in his monograph, Everyday Life, How the Ordinary Became Extraordinary, by arguing, quote, "Everyday life could be narrated in terms of housing, cooking, cleaning, and clothing as playing, working, fighting, and healing. It could equally be narrated in terms of diverse geographies, distinct peoples, groups and classes, and the stages and ways of their lives." The suggestions Amato lists here provide inspiration for what to look for in the various diary entries of my primary material. Everyday activities such as cooking and cleaning, as well as the reality of war, shaped the exile experience of many children that arrived on the Kindertransport in the UK in 1938-39. Their diaries showed that their experiences can be situated at an intersection of ordinary lives and the extraordinary circumstances of war and exile, and highlight aspects of everyday life that are both mundane and unusual. To illustrate these theoretical considerations of diary studies and everyday theory and how they can be combined, I'm quickly drawing on one example from my research project. Ilse Grunwald was born in 1925 in Vienna. She left Austria on a Kindertransport in 1938, just a month after Kristallnacht. The excerpts are taken from her entry written on 4th September 1939. I will read out the German original, but I have included my own translations into English on the slides. Paar Neuigkeiten. Ich war bei einem Abend, da habe ich ein paar Leute wiedergesehen, auch Fanny und Annemarie, Trude in Palästina, und ich habe schon 2,5 Monate keine Nachricht mehr von ihr. Außerdem bin ich nicht mehr bei den Meyers, seit 11 Tagen. Das Komitee hat plötzlich gefunden, dass ich nicht mehr mit Jungen zusammenwohnen darf. Wegen einem ganz gemeinen, unbegründeten Tratsch über Wolli und mich. Die Leute haben eben keine anderen Sorgen. We can already identify a contrast between the historical situation, as the diary entry was written one day after war broke out, and Ilse's focus on the mundane, which culminates in her stating, die Leute haben eben keine andere Sorgen. Those people don't have any other worries. Yet, we could also already see the impact exile and refuge have on her everyday life. She mentions migration, Trude going to Palestina, difficulties with the post, not receiving letters from her, and being governed by the refugee committee who sent her to a new place to live. So coming back to the entry, after expanding on the situation with Bolly and writing a bit about the new place she lives at, she continues in the lower half of the second page of her diary entry. Ich sitze nach wie vor mit den anderen Mädchen, die nichts zu tun haben, herum. Einmal war ich im Austria Club und da war gar nichts los. Und jetzt das Wichtigste, seit gestern, ist Krieg. Ich kann es noch gar nicht fassen. In der Nacht um 3 mussten wir aufstehen. Es wird immer schrecklicher. Was haben wir nur verbrochen, dass man uns so straft? Wann werde ich meine Mutti wiedersehen? Ich kriege immer so schreckliches Heimweh nach ihr. Ilse's entry hints at the longing for something to happen. She seems bored by the everydayness, nothing to do, nichts zu tun haben, and there was nothing going on in the Austria Club. Da war gar nichts los. This, however, stands in contrast to the severity and desperation she displays when writing about the declaration of war, its aftermath, and what that might mean for the future. The entry continues for almost another page where Ilse writes about the uncertainty of her future before exclaiming that she does not care about anything, mir ist schon alles egal, and then returning to more mundane issues of her teenage angst, for example, not receiving a reply to some postcards that she sent to a boy. What Ilse's entry illustrates well is the merging of ordinary and extraordinary experiences during wartime. She writes about aspects such as housing, people, and the lack of work that are a form of narrating her everyday life. But she also writes about the trauma and desperation of the reality of war and exile. The entry is laced with hints of internal struggles, such as the unfamiliarity of her new environment and how she tries to overcome these struggles, for example, by going to the Austria Club and to try to reconnect to people from her country of origin. This entry was written 3 weeks after her previous one from the 15th of August. We can assume that by not leading with the information on the start of the war, she sticks to a certain chronology of events. The ordinariness of everyday life in exile that she emphasizes in her entry can maybe be seen as a coping mechanism where she tries to create structure and familiarity. Discussing her teenage flings, the gossip in the community, and other similar aspects are tactics to resist the constraints of war and exile. In the attempted chronological narration of her life story, Ilse writes about ordinary aspects that are part of the life of a teenage girl, before also reflecting on the reality of war. Kathryn Sederberg argues in this regard that, in a period of crisis, the writing practice can be therapeutic, fulfilling a need for regularity and order. Ilse's diary is a good example for this. It becomes a tool of creating a sense of continuity, of resistance against the constraints of exile, and a tool to reflect on her experiences and the future direction of her life. The entry, but also Ilse's diary in general, are interesting sources that highlight, 1, the fragmentary nature of the content of the diary and the coexistence of reflections on ordinary and extraordinary events, and 2, the drive for stability and continuity that the practice of diary writing itself can give. The fragmentary nature of her diary that is highlighted here through omission and exclusion, through an absence of event at some points, shows that the everyday is not represented as a coherent unit, but as few of the many threads making up the fabric of life, to use Lejeune's terminology once more. To briefly summarize, Kindertransport diaries can be seen as fragmentary writings that accompany daily life during wartime. The practice of diary writing during this time perhaps can be understood as an attempt to bring continuity and stability into a life that is impacted by many outside forces, and therefore the practice becomes a form of resistance. Both the diary itself and the practice of writing a diary suggests a link between the study of diaries and the study of the everyday. Thus, analysing diary writing as an everyday practice and a diary as an everyday object allows us to analyse the content and practice as forms and efforts to try and narrate ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Monja. That was very, very concise and very precise and yeah, really interesting. Great. Let's move straight on to Dominique and then have the discussion afterwards, please. So, Dominique.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Am I speaking loudly enough? I apologize for my sick voice. Partager. There we are. Like this. Oops. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. Merci. I would first like to extend a warm thank you to Dr. Balint for inviting me to share my work with you today and for organizing with her colleagues at the center such a great panel. What I present today is part of a book that I am currently writing on the ambivalences of care in contemporary literature in Quebec. And I selected a section of the chapter on poetry where I analyze the two collections. Oops, right here. Why is it not? There you go. Donc, Clinique by Roselyne Lambert and Quand je ne dis rien, je pense encore by Camille Redmond Prudhomme. Both texts in very different settings reclaim the space-time of the ordinary to instigate a quiet uprising, sort of an understated rebellion in vulnerability through poetic language and gesture. My work on the ordinary draws on cultural anthropologist Kathleen Stewart, who explores in ordinary affects the ordinary as a site of cultural politics through what she calls scenes of precarity and practices of storytelling and witnessing. I also think with anthropologist and philosopher Veena Das, who has written extensively about the potential of the ordinary as a social, moral, and political category for thinking about crises in India, to argue, and I quote, that our theoretical impulse, and I'm quoting here from this book, Life and Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary. And so that our theoretical impulse is often to think of agency in terms of escaping the ordinary rather than as a descent into it. Furthermore, French philosopher Sandra Laugier has theorized and complicated the ordinary within the larger frame of a politics of care to argue that the ordinary as an anthropological motif that shapes life is useful for reclaiming the fundamental place of vulnerability and dependency for subjectivity. Echoing the current work of literary scholars Dion Brand, Christina Sharp, and Libé Garcia Zarranz on, and I quote, a sense of ordinary aliveness for minoritized communities, Laugier's work is crucial for understanding, and I quote, how a sensitivity to words draws our attention to the place of the ordinary in the weaving and detailing of our life forms. So through the care issues and figures that the poetry collections mobilize and complicate, such as the caregiver, the hospital, sorority, hospitality, friendship, and self-care, they offer their own perspective, configured as a politics and poetics of ordinary care. This poetics unfolds more particularly through a refusal of expected behaviors and experiences of pain, and because language and voice are restrained through new modes of expression and relationality. The poetry of Roselyne Lambert in Clinique refuses passivity when facing cruel, inadequate mental health care and refuses the powerlessness that can come with silence and isolation imposed by the space of the mental health institution. In Quand je ne dis rien, je pense encore, Redmond Prudhomme offers a meditative text where the little things that shape memory and social interactions, those little moments that either sustain or tax voice and empathy, are complicated and confronted. In an interview, Redmond Prudhomme said that she wanted to put a finger on things so small that it would be impossible to consider them events, but that they would be perfect to make poems instead. And so her poetic voice reacts sometimes in shame and sometimes in rebellion, and I quote, parfois dans la honte et d'autres fois dans la révolte, through a writing gesture that with great sensitivity both seeks and mistrusts relationality. In her exploration of the vulnerable, at times ostracizing experience of social interaction, the poet mobilizes the night, which can be both reparative and sacrificial as symbol and space-time. In the darkness of the night, the poetic voice's thought process can slow down and find a certain sense of freedom. She writes, Quand on pense à la nuit, on pense à ce qu'on y perd, le repos ou sa sérénité. Quand on traverse la nuit pour quelqu'un, on se dépense. A similar configuration of the night appears in Lambert's collection as the poetic voice finds time to think and imagine escaping tactics only at night in the absence of surveillance. The textures of the ordinary are thus where the refusal and the possibility for reinvention find a place, and ordinary where what seems innocuous, inoffensive, is reclaimed in vulnerability to depart from relational norms and expectations that tax the subject's experience of suffering. In Clinique, Lambert uses a vocabulary of medical violence to revisit her experience in a mental health care facility, poetizing an enigmatic space where the speaker is kept. The latter qualifies her confinement as ma démesure ordinaire, an ordinary disproportion or excess where order and disorder, powerlessness and empowerment are constantly negotiated. Using the adjective ordinaire along with the possessive ma subverts the inhabitual, extraordinary aspect of a stay in a mental health facility, conventionally associated with the idea of démesure, as if the speaker sought to make sense of what was happening by rejecting the institutional codes of care that ironically dehumanize her and other patients, whom she identifies as, and I quote, une lignée de fous, a line of lunatics. The oxymoron démesure ordinaire exacerbates the ambivalence that structures the space of care and underlines the normalized aspect of a healthcare system portrayed as coercive and perpetuating a double violence, where, and I quote, l'endroit hurle, l'endroit est à l'envers de ceux qui marchent ordinaires. And where, I quote again, nos vies mortes s'éteignent. In the section titled Injection, the speaker repeats the line, Je ne vous dis pas ça. I'm not telling you this. Que je cultive, je ne vous dis pas ça. So poetizing a refusal to communicate despite the fear of receiving worst care. Je ne vous dis pas ça que je cultive un champ de plantes croches pour envahir l'ordinaire d'indomptables résistances. Along with the paratextual strategy on every page of counting the days with tally marks, the agency of the subject is expressed by action verbs that stem from a labor of the soil, a metaphor of repossession of the ordinary with an imperfect, fragile mix of crooked plans that yet are irreducible, that are persistent and invasive. In this ordinary vulnerability in resistance, it is this ordinary vulnerability in resistance that operates to allow the speaker's risky escape in the final section of the collection. Lambert's poetics of restraints and her representation of the difficulty to vocalize pain resonates with Redmond Prudhomme's poetics of relational struggle, structured in fragments that investigate the ordinary, but not necessarily thinking of them as minor struggles that jeopardize social relations. Proactive in her relational search, the speaker explicitly names her resistance to and refusal of indifference and manipulation. And I quote, Lorsque j'ai l'impression qu'on ne cherche pas ma présence, mais mon adhésion, je me braque ou m'en vais. The speaker measures the ordinary authenticity of relations and how she reacts to fraudulent interactions. I quote again, Je me disloque quand je sens que je deviens une image et qu'échanger devient une affaire de camouflage ou de contention. Later on, the speaker recognizes the care in relations with others who do not weaponize her difficulty to speak legibly, with whom relationship is possible beyond language. I quote again, Avec certaines personnes, tu sais que l'expression de tes difficultés ne sera pas convertie en défaillance. Tu sais que tu peux parler en lambeaux ou en fumée. Vous vous connaissez par votre façon de faire des liens. This vulnerability, this awareness of a relationality that doesn't necessarily make the connection easier nor inherently good, allows taking into account through the poetic speech what she names in another fragment, la rugosité des rapports, and the roughness of relationships, and the type of intersubjective expression it demands and brings into focus, especially in the experience of relational struggle due to illness. To that extent, Quand je ne dis rien, je pense encore mobilizes a care discourse on mental health through poetic gesture as a capacity to see and pay attention to how relations are done and undone, how they are sustained or damaged through speech and silence. And I quote, Pour moi, être fou, ce n'est pas parler seul, c'est épouser une intransigeance. The restraints here are not physical like in clinique. They symbolize differently this need for the other in ordinary vulnerability, as well as the rejection of the other in moments of crisis, which is represented by an image of the speaker falling on the ground in spring, which evokes here seasonal depression. And I quote again, C'est au printemps que je tombe, quand il n'y a nulle part pour le sombre, quand sortir porte la promesse de nouvelles cruautés. The unavailable darkness resonates with the space-time of the night, here associated with quietness and openness, through which the speaker frees herself from the expectations and restraints that keep her in a state of fragility made worse by misleading words, relational obligation, and performativity. About the night, the speaker remarks, Je la trouve quand je descends vers l'autre. And so when words fail because they aren't heard or allowed, the night symbolizes another form of relational language kept alive in thought through a reinvention of this descent towards the other, a descent in ordinary vulnerability. And this is why I suggest that both poets follow Nicole Brossard's advice, Il y a des nuits en nous, il faut s'en occuper. In both collections, the exploration of silence speaks to responsive and responsible modes of being with, of staying with pain, illness, and relation. Modes that rely on an attentive, caring uncertainty that seeks an alternative way of living relationally. A mark of ordinary vulnerability, this hypervigilant uncertainty confronts the obligation to silence, the sacrifice of speech, when the communication, the relation fails or reveals itself as damaging or superficial. Lambert and Redmond Prudhomme do so without relying on hope or on glorified good intentions, in a lucid interrogation of what sustains and threatens the intersubjective rapport to vulnerability and dependence. Such a poetics of care dwells on the politics of the ordinary, in its reshaping of a vulnerable life, in its singular treatment of the relational sensible, in a language that directs our attention to poetry as a way to descend in care towards the ordinary, as a space of transformative relationality. Merci. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Can already see some links to what Monja was talking about, which is wonderful. I look forward to exploring that further. But first, let's hear from Adina. Adina?
Yes, thank you very much. So first, I would like to take this moment and thank Dr. Godela Weiss-Sussex and the Institute for Contemporary Women's Studies for welcoming this session. I will just share the screen. So my talk today will be an overview of everyday life writing in contemporary literature written in French. And I organized my presentation around a couple of points. So first, I will briefly give you the context of what we call in French l'écriture du quotidien. Then I will give you some examples of everyday life writing. I will also focus on the dialogue that this type of writing makes with social sciences, I will also mention briefly the blurring of borders between theoretical and literary writing, and how the field of literary studies can be expanded through everyday life writing. And my conclusion will be more or less a couple of questions and opening up for the discussion. So first, I would like to start with a question, asking simply, what is there in common between the writing of Annie Ernaux, for instance, the winner of the 2022 Nobel Prize for Literature, who has transcribed for a couple of years scenes captured in the RER, which is the suburbs train in Paris. She also transcribed scenes from the supermarkets. So what does this writing has in common with the writing of a contemporary French writer, Adèle Van Rett, who consecrated a whole book to ordinary life, and the writing of Georges Perec, who in the 1980s writes down observations he's making while he's sitting at a table in a cafe in Paris. So all these writers strive to write everyday life, to put life in the forefront of the narrative. And these writings, which could be described as l'écriture du quotidien, emerged in France in the beginning of the 1980s and have since developed quite a bit. And they are now, they constitute now a component within the panorama of contemporary French literature. What's interesting to note is that critics started identifying them as such in the first decade of the years 2000. And the year 2006 saw the publication of two studies which were dedicated to the everyday life, to the quotidien. So first, the work Mémoire du quotidien, les lieux de Perec, by Derek Schilling, published in 2006, devoted to Georges Perec, and the very well-known work of Michael Sheringham, Everyday Life, published in 2006 as well, in which he traces the invention of the everyday as a notion in the humanities and in literature in France in the 20th century, from the Surrealist movement until the beginning of the year 2000. And this study constitutes to date the only overall study devoted to this phenomenon, which is partially devoted to literature only. So this shows that, in fact, the reflection or the thinking on the everyday constitutes a field of study which is largely undeveloped at the moment, whereas it has been much studied for decades in social sciences, which developed a thought of the everyday beginning in the 20th century, and then this reflection increased in the second half of the century, particularly in Europe and in the United States. And here I can mention that in history, we have L'École des Annales in the 1920s, also the notion of the microhistoria in Italy, which focused on micro events historically. In sociology, I can mention the work of Georg Simmel, Alfred Schulz, and the sociologist Erich Goffman. And in philosophy, the everyday thinking is quite a lot explored in movements such as pragmatism, phenomenology, the philosophy of ordinary language, from Wittgenstein to Stanley Cavell. But the fact that today there is a field of study and a discipline of research that's called everyday life studies is a testimony to the fact that everyday life has established itself as a field, as a discipline in the humanities. So when I'm thinking about literature, it's important to note that the exploration of the everyday is essential for at least two more other reasons. So first, the fact that the literary texts that explore the everyday life often establish a sustained dialogue with social sciences, which encourages somehow the reflection on interdisciplinarity. And second, most of these contemporary texts on everyday life studies, sur le quotidien, are qualified as experimental. They have a hybrid status, they are fragmentary. And so to advance the reflection on this topic, I will briefly focus on these two dimensions in order to find a way of questioning the extension of the field of literary studies today. So first of all, when we speak about l'écriture du quotidien, we ask ourselves, how can we define this? And it turns out that the notion of the everyday writing is not self-evident. So if the everyday struggles to establish itself as an object of study in literature, it is perhaps of its lability, the difficulty of definition that characterizes it. The everyday that may seem the simplest, the most obvious, turns out to slip through our fingers as soon as we try to grasp it. And the French writer and philosopher Maurice Blanchot states, "Le quotidien échappe, c'est sa définition." So the quotidien is defined always by this slipperiness. And then Blanchot adds, "Le quotidien, c'est ce qu'il y a de plus difficile à découvrir." So despite everything, what we can call everyday writing today, we can argue that the singularity of this type of writing is due to the fact that it endeavors to capture the everyday for itself, while in general, the everyday is being subject of a poetic project which always tries to transcend it. Monja just mentioned the extraordinary. So especially in the realistic novels of the 19th century, there is this tendency, and also the surrealist writings, which constitute the great predecessor of everyday writing. So the surrealists are always searching for the miracle, for the surreality going beyond the ordinary. So under the nomination of everyday writing, we can mention texts that explore urban wanderings, La Flânerie, for instance, in Annie Ernaux or Régine Robin in Quebec. There are other forms of everyday writing that present themselves more like socio-anthropological surveys. The historical narratives of Philippe Artière, for instance, or even Yvan Jean Blanca. There are also writings that explore the poetry of the objects and offer small phenomenologies of the everyday, focusing on the elements of the quotidien, like the text of Adèle Van Rett. And as I mentioned, there is also the dialogue with social sciences. And these writings take off in a very particular context, since they are preceded in France by a theoretical effervescence around the everyday, which started in mid-20th century, particularly between 1945 and 1980s. And the first work in France, published in 1947, c'est La critique de la vie quotidienne de Henri Lefebvre. And then we can mention in the 1980s, the first volume of L'Invention du quotidien de Michel de Certeau. And in between, there is the work of Roland Barthes, Maurice Blanchot, and also Michel Foucault. But we shouldn't forget Georges Perec, who is the only writer in this panorama of theoreticians who also provided a theoretical thinking on the notion of l'infraordinaire, the infraordinary. So he was the one trying to look below the ordinary, paying attention to the background noise of our lives, the things so small, so minute that we usually do not pay attention to them. These things which were considered not to be worthy to appear in literature. And Perec produced always hybrid texts, fragmentary, halfway between scientific research and literary writing, the emblematic example being his famous essay, Espèce d'espace. So just to mention briefly the blurring of borders between theoretical and literary the theoretical and the literary. I'm focusing on the work of Adèle Van Rett, on her book published chez Gallimard in 2020, La vie ordinaire, which presents itself as an autobiographical type of writing blended with philosophical reflections on the everyday. And this type of writing promotes a form which is usually considered non-literary. And here I'm giving you an example of an enumeration of small gestures, almost a list that Adèle Van Rett puts forward that pushes the border of what we consider literary or the literarité. So we are dealing here with an experimental type of literature in the sense that these contemporary books on the quotidien, on the everyday, relate experiences of the writer, but also make a bridge with the experience of the reader. These texts engage not only the writing, but also the body of the writer. In several interviews, Adèle Van Rett speaks about how the writing of this book has somehow structured her everyday routines and everyday habits. And at the same time, she mentions that perhaps such a writing also invites the writer to reflect on their everyday practices and experiences. And also in his famous text, Espèce d'espace, Georges Perec somehow interrogates the reader, saying, faites l'inventaire de vos poches, so make the inventory of your pockets. It's a metaphorical way of inviting the reader to actively engage in a sort of an exploration of their everyday experiences and practices. And just to conclude, I would like to add that this brief overview reveals the interest for a reflection on the renewals of the field of literature and its theorization today. And a certain number of these contemporary writings engage a dialogue with other disciplines, which is largely due to the unique genealogy of the notion of the everyday, as it originates in social sciences and crosses several fields and disciplines. There is also the hybridity of the text, their fragmentation and their experimental status, and their way of pushing the questioning of literarity to its limits. And these writers question not only the borders between the theoretical and the artistic, but also the borders between life and art itself. And ultimately, saying and writing the ordinary seems to put to test our ability of perception and attention, as well as our ability to represent with words, which can be even more important for critical theory around this notion of the quotidien, of the everyday studies. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. Oh, fantastic. What a great great array of views we've had. I certainly invite questions now. So if you want to ask a question straight out, just I don't know, can you unmute yourself? Yes, I suppose you can. Yeah, good. I have a lot of questions myself, but I'll hand over to you first. So Shirley.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. 3 brilliant papers. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed them, and there are lots of very fertile links between them. So one of the things that always interests me about the everyday is the kind of overwhelming amount of data that the everyday presents us with. And the problem then, particularly if we're thinking of things like sub-events that Dominique talked about, or l'infraordinaire, it's just literally inexhaustible. And hence you've got, the problem of the ethnographer doing participant observation and realizing that everything's important. So my question really is about the problem of choice and how much these writers, from the children to the literary writers that we're looking at, are I suppose, self-consciously aware of the problem of choice in the way they write about and with the everyday. So it's a question for everybody, really. But they were great papers. Thank you.
Should I go first? I can. I've unmuted myself. Thank you very much for this question. I think choice, especially with poetry, is so important. I would start with the titles, right? So with Roselyne Lambert, the title is Clinique. So here we have it. It's going to be about this particular experience, which she is trying to revisit. And so the choice is about, and there are a few other fragments, of course, that I could not present, but she makes the choice as well of situating her own experience through the speaker with other patients' experiences. And so there's a relational choice. And to me, this is what really drives my own reading. It's the relational choice. It's the relational intention. And it's this objective of examining the relationality and its problems and its difficulties. So for me, what really sort of drives my interest when I look at a text is its choice on relationality and its choice on accountability as well. That's why I talked about responsive and responsible modes of relationality. So I think that's where I would start the conversation about choice here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can carry on. Monja, would you like to jump in, or? Thank you very much for the question. So in terms of prose, of narrative, in prose, the scope is very large. I will just give you one example of the contemporary writer Adèle van Rett. The title of her book is La vie quotidienne. So she takes herself as an object of exploration, as a subject of her own exploration, but at the same time, she brings in social sciences, philosophy. She performs kind of like surveys. So for me, in my readings, in my research, I find that the thinking of the everyday and the writing, like L'écriture du quotidien, is very resourceful to open up literature to other disciplines, to think in terms of interdisciplinarity, and to see how literature resonates with philosophy, with sociology. Annie Ernaux, she always defends herself from, providing a sort of a self-narrative. For her, the literature at the first person is a way of exploring broadly more experiences. She takes her own life as an entry to open up the conversation and to bring sociology, Pierre Bourdieu, or like other fields into conversation. So I would just I think they have a sort of like their choice is voluntary, and there is a purpose in their exploration. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna probably draw attention to like the format, or like sort of the genre that we're working with. So obviously, like we have 3 different genres, and the diaries that I'm studying, they don't really have like a specific intended reader in mind that isn't either the diarist or the close family. So I think that sort of impacts what they choose to write about. So obviously, like they live through extraordinary circumstances of war. So you see like a lot of that reflected. But also it really depends on their like life, or like the stages of their life. So we see a lot of boy trouble with like teenage girls, with younger children. We see football results and stuff. So I think it's like this focus on like the very ordinary things that you associate with what your life should be like as in this age, as like an 8-year-old child, as a 13-year-old child. And yeah, you sort of see the efforts to reflect on these ordinary experiences of, okay, I've been at school, I got my report today, whatever, and then like, oh, there was an air raid. So it's sort of this contrast, and I think they sort of try in their diaries to maintain a sort of normal life, but obviously that's not possible in wartime. But yeah, the question was very fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from, I know Melissa is just saying thank you. So not a question.
Oh, I did have a question. Sorry, I put the wrong icon up.
Oh, brilliant. Good.
Hi, everybody. I'll be quick because it's such short time. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at University of Manchester, interested in innovative writing. And I just want to commend all of you for getting so much clarity and richness across in such a short time. It was really fantastic. I just had a question for Dominique, actually. A lot of questions. I was wondering about your discussion of the politics of care and ethics of care. I don't know, I'm curious about what year these texts are written in, and if there's any dialogue with this kind of discourse of radical love, and if you've thought about that at all, and what that might be. And then I was also curious, you know, there's such different forms. Do you see this relationality being more a subject of the content or the form? Yeah, I was just wondering those couple of things.
Thank you. Excellent questions. On the idea of radical love, not so much in those with those theorists. So Kathleen Stewart, Vina Das especially, they approach care really from the ground up, right? So I'm really working from a culture from below perspective, where the ordinary. That's why I love so much this metaphor of the descent towards the ordinary, right, into the ordinary. Because they help me avoid this sort of romanticized version of care as being always good. So that's why I think I also try to steer clear from love, which can bring in a whole different set of language. But for this radical idea of love, though, I think it can be very rich and productive, certainly. And the first figure that came into my head was Bell Hooks, who's written certainly on similar ideas from a very different set of experiences. So it's not a language that's come up in that sort of paradigm, the ethics of care. It has a lot more to do with ideas of autonomy, interdependency, and those things, because they are mostly sociologists and political scientists, and, you know, rather than literary scholars or philosophers. So that would be for a first part. And then the second, about form, especially with poetry, I think the fragment is doing something really interesting with relationality, because it both separates and yet it's always tying in with what comes next. And I really, I don't have the collection with me here, but those tally marks that sort of connect each fragment together in Clinique, for example, they keep that connection. So I think it is one paratextual form of relationality. But I would, yeah, I certainly think form, of course, is playing a major role in the relational aspect, because then why choose poetry if not to create that connection? In Quand je ne dis rien, je pense encore, they're very dense fragments. There's not a lot of breathing space on the page, which I think is very interesting. And then when you go in different sections, then the lines are, you know, all spaced out. So I think it creates an interesting play here on the relationality of the lines themselves. But I would definitely need to think more. I mean, my chapter is 50 pages, right? So we'll have to get the book.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That's interesting, because I had read I thought the Clinique was more straightforward. So knowing that there are those sort of formal indicators there is quite interesting too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dominique, for the plug for your book. We hope it comes out soon.
Can I ask a question for Adina? I was listening to your talk and I couldn't help but think, is the everyday the new flanage, right? Is the everyday, especially, it was interesting to see the theorists who, and I, you know, we've talked about this before, but there were mostly men. And then you talked about Régine Robin and Annie Ernaux and Adèle Van Ret, who are women, and the domestic is never in that conversation of the everyday. And so I was really, and then Monja, you talked about the boys' experiences, and you know, you just talked about that. So I was trying to think about why is, yet again, just like back then with André Breton and Nadia and the flanage, you know, why is the domestic so difficult to integrate in those conversations about the everyday, you know?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. Thank you, Dominique. So I think, like, just to avoid sort of like male, female, or like male writer, women writer, like this sort of dichotomy and the polarization between the two. So I think women writers, and, you know, Annie Ernaux, Adèle Van Rett, so they try to integrate somehow reflections on the domestic life, domestic experiences or practices, and also open up to broader conversations about, you know, like how can we cope, for instance, with the longue durée, like with the long time, with the routine, with the repetition, with the sort of like habit, and still keep our rhythm, like intellectually stimulated, or like be agents of our daily experiences, instead of somehow being always subdued, or like somehow taking these experiences as being overwhelming, like somehow shifting the look towards all these tiny gestures or tiny objects and elements of the everyday that were not explored, were not considered worthy of being in a narrative, or were attached to the feminine self more. And there, the ethics of care helps to displace this kind of look or perspective. And I think women as well, like can afford today to be flâneuses, like to come out and, you know, move like in the city without having like a purpose. And Régine Robin, I think, gives an example of the agency of a subject that's always renewing identity through movement, through experiences of.
And there was also Kathryn Nessie's book, right, on La Flâneuse. Exactly.
Right, yes,
so I think
yes.
there can be yeah, merci.
Thank you very much. So Monja, I think, yes, you can probably, thank you very much.
Monja, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can say, I feel like there's always this sort of apprehension of, like, especially with diaries, like it's often thought of as a female genre, and then like it's just sort of like this disconnect of like having like a really male heavy theory field on everyday studies, or even diary studies. Like only recently, I think they've been more focused on basically like moving away from this gendered perspective and just sort of looking at it in a different way. And I think that's where the everyday is actually really useful, that like sort of if you investigate everyday literature, or like literature about the everyday, then like sort of looking at different domestic spheres where, well, at the domestic sphere will actually like allow us to move away from that gendered perspective, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Great, that's great. I see the time is up, but I do want to ask one last question. And I just listening to you now, Adina, I was thinking so much of the Impressionists. And, you know, it was really the same sort of movement, wasn't it? You know, we are not just looking for historical subjects. We're not looking for subjects that, you know, that are worth being painted. We want the detail. We want, you know, the everyday, essentially. So what do? They paint the everyday, like there's this, yeah, you know, whatever it is, a chair, you know, a vegetable, whatever. But by doing that, they're making the ordinary extraordinary. And this is, so much. I'm really thinking about that. The moment you write about it, the moment you draw the attention to it, you make it extraordinary, don't you? Is that why the everyday is a better word than the ordinary, possibly?
So I think perhaps Dominique can also give an answer to this question. So in French is like we have several synonyms, like for French literature. So the word is like le quotidien, and also like la vie ordinaire. But la vie ordinaire is more explored in philosophical terms, like in social sciences and in philosophy, like Sandra Logier, like les théories du care. And l'écriture du quotidien, so the term has been more used in literary theory to look at the form of these writings, and also at the topics, the recurrent themes that can allow us to think about contemporary écriture du quotidien and see what it has in common and how it can push or extend the field of contemporary writing today, as other writings do, like historical writing or l'écriture du territoire, like the ones or terroir. So I totally agree, but I with this shift like towards the extraordinary. But in my readings, I see more and more the contemporary literary critics speak about the quotidien for itself, like trying to push away this kind of idealizing perspective of le quotidien as something that we delve into and we feel comfortable, even if there is someone like Mona Chollet that really reflected on what it means to be chez soi, like at home during the pandemic, and how the space allows us to become better selves, if I may say. I'm not sure, Dominique, if you have anything to add to.
Well, I really appreciate this distinction that you make between, let's say, the use that they have in social sciences versus the literary. It's a bit like empathy, right? Empathy was born in with aesthetics, so it's grounded more in that sort of perspective. And for example, I don't use the everyday and the ordinary interchangeably. To me, they're very different. Just like every day is not necessarily ordinary, right? To me, that's a very important distinction to make. That's why I only focus on the ordinary in my work, also because I bring it together with care and with this bigger umbrella term. And that's why, the French language is so interesting. And we have the same issue with care that we just use as care in French because we don't want to have all these issues with le soin and then, all of these options. And so I would be careful with conflating everyday, quotidien, and ordinaire or ordinary. I wouldn't, because they do different things and they behave differently and they're mobilized differently as well, I think, in literature and in politics especially. Yeah, that's what I would say for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Adina, Shirley is asking you about the author you quoted in terms of writing at home during the pandemic.
It's Mona Chollet.
Okay, and then I just really want to thank you again, because it was a fantastic session. It all fit together very well, and I have gone away with a list of reading to do. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.